What's up, guys? Quinn Henoch here, Doctor of Physical Therapy from Juggernaut Training Systems. We're going to talk about a commonly used term in the fitness industry, the dreaded butt wink in the bottom of a squat. And so just to even explain this, I'm going to give you guys a visual of what we're talking about, then discuss if it matters, how much does it matter, and then some things that we can do to potentially mitigate or optimize positioning in the bottom of your squat. So I'm going to have our athlete here, Elaine, demonstrate just a regular air squat. And what you'll see is as she squats down, there's a relative amount of a posterior pelvic tilt. Do that again for us so we can see that visual. And that's what we're referring to when we talk about butt wink. It's like that tailbone is winking underneath. So we describe it as the pooping dog squat. And then come up and show that one more time. And so with that posterior pelvic tilt is accompanied some relative amount of lumbar flexion. And this is where the talks about this being a dangerous position or movement come about because of the research shown with lumbar flexion being an injury mechanism for disc herniation. However, what we're finding in the literature from researchers like Vygotsky, McGill even, and McKean in movements like the good morning, the kettlebell swing, and the squat is that neutral spine is a range. It's not a fixed position. So there is some room for movement there, and especially when we're talking about a squat. And they're finding that this small amount of movement at the bottom is almost unavoidable to a certain degree. So stand up for me. The way that I cue, because then the question is, okay, if it's a range, how much posterior pelvic tilt, lumbar flexion, butt wink is too much? And the way that I coach is my recommendation is make sure you look at their actual bottom position. So slowly squat down, Elaine. So as she descends, at a certain point, you'll start to see some movement in her pelvis. So you see that, just pause. Just at the bottom there, you see that movement. That's technically what we would term posterior pelvic tilt or butt wink as a slang term. However, look at the actual end position. She's still in a very, very safe, neutral position here. I would feel comfortable loading that position. Even though you saw a change, this is what we say, show that one more time. This is what we say when neutral, it's a range. And so you have a little wiggle room. And what we think is that unavoidable slight amount of posterior movement at the bottom of the squat is perfectly safe. You see it tilt just at the very, very end. But look at that finish position, still a good position. Now, completely relax and just let everything kind of fall and flex. You see this is a relative amount. I mean, she's in actual lumbar flexion, and we're not even gonna talk about that as an injury mechanism. I don't even wanna go there. We're just gonna talk about that in terms of force production. If there's movement in the core, pelvis, spine, as you're trying to transfer load, let's say she has a bar on her back, you're gonna lose some of that power through your trunk. It's gonna be dissipated. And so yes, I certainly agree that we wanna minimize motion. Go ahead and stand up again and show us another squat where you're a little bit more stable. You wanna minimize motion occurring at the pelvis and the lower back, but understand that there's just gonna be some there, and it's not good or bad. It just is, it's a normal mechanics. And then boom, and you see a little bit of a tuck, but look at the finished position is still relatively flat, and I feel very, very comfortable loading that position. Go ahead and stand up for me. Lay on your back, and we're gonna talk about common misconceptions here. Some people will say hamstring length is a cause of butt wink. So as you're squatting down, the hamstring lengthens at the hip. And so if your hamstrings are quote unquote too tight, then as you squat down, short hamstrings tucks your pelvis underneath you. However, we saw Elaine exhibit a little bit of that posterior pelvic tilt. Straighten your legs. And so then if tight hamstrings are a cause, then she must have tight hamstrings. Do you even feel a stretch right there? Is that okay? So not tight hamstrings. What we see, all a posterior pelvic tilt and a butt wink is the pelvis, you're kind of running out of space in your hips, and the pelvis hits that barrier and just rolls backwards in order for you to go a little bit deeper. So my number one recommendation is maybe to lift the squatter or the lifter out of their very, very bottom position. And so they're not burying their squat where they completely lose tension and position, but just raise them up a little bit and say you're still going to go below parallel. She was still well below parallel, but maybe just that extra inch or two, you take them out of that when they're under load so that they can keep that more neutral position. But, you know, again, assessing the hips, there's no, I feel no resistance, and this is more commonly, obviously Elaine's got pretty good mobility, but it's more common than not for me to move somebody's hip around and for it to move very freely without any restriction, without the pelvis rolling backwards, but then they exhibit or they demonstrate a tilt in their pelvis. And so what that speaks to me is they have plenty of mobility in the joint structures and the musculature that's going to be involved in the movement, but maybe we haven't optimized their position so that their hips can sit straight down. Maybe they're lacking some stability. So we'll take that into a counterbalance squat. Here, go and stand up for me. And this is where a new lifter will just experiment with different stances. But I like to put a counterbalance in front of them because it just takes the worry about having to fall on your butt or you know, the balance component of the squat out of the equation because we're just teaching here. So go a little more narrow, go super narrow, toes forward, and then squat down. And so you can see, now this is actually, from a resting squat position, I have no problem with this. But you can definitely tell as she descended into her squat, we ran out of a little room in the hips, and she rounded just a touch up there. Now this could be a perfect opportunity to come out of the hole a little bit, right there, and just hold. So now she flattens back out, that's a good position, but we incorporate pauses and tempo when trying to eliminate a bunch of movement in the bottom of a squat because that's gonna strengthen them. So I'll cue her, breathe in through your nose, exhale really hard like you're blowing out 100 candles. So that gets her abs engaged. She's staying tight through her lower back and her abs, and then come up for me. But I would argue that this stance is probably not super optimal for her. It's crowding her hips. It doesn't allow her to just sit comfortably between her feet. So I would cue a little bit wider stance and maybe a slight degree of toe out. But this is, again, something that you can just experiment. Now, slowly squat straight down. And pause. Very, very good. You did see, if you look very closely, you're seeing degrees, minute changes in pelvic position. I believe that is, hold that, I believe that is the unavoidable quote unquote butt wink that the researchers are showing. It just happens. But if you look at the ending position, it's still solid. And I'll have her pause here. Breathe in, exhale really hard, create tension, maybe hold that weight away from you. Tight, 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 good. Come up 2 inches, hold, breathe in, exhale hard. Good, you can see her shaking, it's it's abs, it's strenuous, the hips, everything is working. There's no one muscle that is the culprit here. Now sit a little deeper, good, and look, totally straight there and stand back up. So we, quote unquote, can cure the butt wink, it's not a disease, if we just teach positions. We optimize stance, we make sure that they don't actually have restrictions in their hip mobility, but I promise you that very, very few athletes have such restricted ability to flex their hip up that that is the reason. And if that is the case, we're probably not jamming them into the bottom of a squat anyway. We're working them to a box, or we're putting a ball, a big medicine ball underneath their hips so they can sit straight down. We're giving them the counterbalance option for them to experiment with different positions. Over time, they will gain the mobility and strength to be able to hold the position. But it's a big topic, this whole butt wink, but just understand the bottom line is it may not be a problem, and make sure you're actually looking at the positions that they finish in rather than seeing motion and freaking out. Because you may just get an athlete who likes to be super extended, and then they just go from extension to neutral at the bottom of the squat. But observationally, it happens so quickly that you saw motion and you say, oh, that must be a problem. Sometimes they're just within that safe range. So that's that butt wink discussion, guys. If you have questions, you can leave it in the comments. If you need to find a healthcare provider who understands athletes, go check out the directory at www.clinicalathlete.com. Thanks, guys.